He got ambushed by a force of 100 men. Luckily for him, that makes it a fair fight. We again start off on a battlefield. This time, it's the Band of the Hawk fighting against the forces of Tudor. We see Casca tearing up the battlefield, except she seems to be slightly off her game when she gets approached by a general of the Tudor army. He tells her that the battlefield is a place sacred to men, and women should not step foot on it, before demeaning her by stating that she must only be in her position because she slept with Griffith. She charges in, but gets knocked to the ground by, what's your name again?
I, Adon, leader of the mighty Blue Whale Ultra Heavy Armored Fierce Assault Annihilation Night Corps.
Yeah, I'm not calling you that. 3 members of the Hawks ride in, trying to help Casca, but they get easily dispatched by Adon. He then begins to attack Casca, pushing her back towards the edge of a cliff. He goes in for a big strike when it gets blocked by the main man himself. He tells Casca to pull it together and hits Adon away. Adon charges back in with his ultimate 140-year-old family secret technique.
Guns and send booms!
Upon knocking him back, Guts rides over to Casca, asking her what's wrong, saying that he's never seen her like this before. Casca looks dazed and begins to pass out near the side of the cliff, falling backwards off it. Guts grabs her when Adon, somehow, pulls a crossbow out of his pocket, shooting Guts in the side, causing both of them to fall into the river below. A short time later, as it begins to rain, Guts pulls both of them out of the river and notices that Casca has a fever. He sees a small cave off in the distance that they might be able to hole up in. Inside the cave, Guts is patching up his injuries when he notices Casca's fever is getting worse. He decides to take off her clothes as they are soaked, and wonders why she thought she could fight when she has a fever. He notices blood on his hands and thinks she must be wounded somewhere, when he realizes that she is wounded, but it's from her own body.
I guess it's hard, being a woman.
He wrings the water out of her clothes and stays on watch, keeping her warm. About a day later, Casca wakes up and asks Guts what's happened. He explains that they're in a cave down by the river that they fell into, and she starts to get up. He urgently tells her not to, saying that her fever hasn't fully broken yet and she would still be weak. He apologizes for taking off her clothes, but he was worried she would freeze to death otherwise. When he asks her if she's lost her mind, when she just starts throwing a bunch of shit at him. He says he just saved her life. If it wasn't for him, she'd be dead, and if it wasn't for the fact that she's a woman, he would knock her out. He tells her that she's always ready to just fly into a rage, and that's why women shouldn't be allowed on the battlefield. Casca starts crying, saying it's not her fault. She didn't ask to be born a woman. She says she hates this. Out of everyone, he was the only person she didn't want to be rescued by. She again begins to pass out and Guts runs over to her. He picks up her unconscious body and brings her back into the cave, thinking to himself she must really hate him. A short time later, Casca is awake and asks Guts if he remembers when he joined the Hawks. After his duel with Griffith, she asks him if he remembers the words of Griffith saying that he wanted him and telling him to join them. Guts says he does, and she says that he is the only person Griffith has ever said that about. Casca asks him why it couldn't be her. Why couldn't she be Griffith's sword instead of him? Guts says he understands and realizes it must be Casca's dream to be Griffith's right-hand man. Or I should say, woman. Nearby, we see several of Adon's men out searching for Guts and Casca. Guts tells Casca they can't stay here any longer. In the late afternoon, they suit up and make their way out. As they're walking through the forest, Casca says that she's told him her reason for fighting, and asks him about his. Unsure himself, he doesn't really give an answer. Then, they come across a large ambush set up by Adon. He makes some seedy threats before telling his men to attack. A few charge in, but get promptly dealt with. Guts then tells Casca that he is going to clear a path for her, but after he does, she doesn't leave, saying that she isn't going to let him fight all these men alone. He tells her no offense, but she's not in the best state right now, and would probably only get in the way. Nearby, Adon tells his crossbowmen to focus fire on Casca. As their bolts loose, Guts rushes over, using his body as a shield. She asks him why. Why would he risk his life for her? When he pulls out the bolt that hit him, telling her to go back to her dream, go back to Griffith. In the meantime, he'll think about an answer to her question about why he fights. Casca begins to run off, promising to bring back reinforcements, telling Guts not to die. Guts begins to take his helmet off, as Adon orders his men not to let Casca escape. Guts tells them they better finish their fight with him before they go chasing after women. The fun for him is just about to start. As he dices through a few men, he cops a bolt in his left hand. Adon berates him, saying he won't be able to swing around his massive sword with just one hand. Guts replies, saying it'll just make things a bit more fun for him is all. We cut to Casca, running away through the woods. Still not feeling 100%, she isn't able to outrun the few men who are chasing her, and one of them throw boulders at her feet, tangling her up and knocking her to the ground. They pin her to the ground, and after she tries to fight back, they tell her to just give it up. They begin to assault her, ripping her clothes off. When she fights back, stabbing the man in the eye before breaking out of her entanglement. She briefly runs away, when the men catch up and are about to attack, when bolts suddenly fly into them from the side. We see Griffith with a group of men on the hill above. who run down and see if she's alright. She immediately tells Griffith that Guts stayed back so she could escape, but he's by himself and heavily outnumbered. Judeau orders every available man to go and help him. Cutting back to Guts, we see even though his vision is fading and he has suffered numerous wounds, he's still pushing on, destroying anyone who comes at him. While fighting, he wonders to himself what he's even doing here. What is he doing in this miserable place? Fighting. He's risking his life and he doesn't even know what for. Griffith's words on that night play in his head, talking about his dream and how he finds it detestable to live out your life simply because you were born into it. At this point, Gus becomes resolute in trying to find his dream, as without having his own dream, he will never be seen as an equal by Griffith, and could never truly be his friend. With that out of the way, he begins to completely tear up Adon's men, no longer thinking, just focusing on the fight at hand. Upon seeing the carnage, Adon's men begin to flee in terror. While trying to keep his men in line, Adon gets knocked onto the ground and passes out. Guts continues to cut down dozens of men. We cut to dawn and can see Casca leading everyone back the way she came from. They reach the battlegrounds and we can see at least 100 dead soldiers on the ground in the nearby area. Casca manages to find Guts propped up on a nearby tree, doing his best impression of a corpse. They all surround him, thinking the worst. Casca runs up and starts shaking him. He grabs her, telling her to knock it off. It isn't helping his pain. Nearby, Adon is found and captured, and Judeau declares Guts the 100-man slayer. Elsewhere, we see the forces of Midland assaulting the fortress stronghold known as Doldrey. The fortress is considered to be completely impregnable, and no one has ever successfully captured it before. After their failed attempt at scaling the walls, the gates open and out rides the fearsome heavy cavalry known as the Purple Rhino Knights, who tears a path through Midland's ranks. After the battle, all of Midland's generals are discussing battle plans at a war table. They all agree that if they can somehow breach Doldrey, due to the inner conflict and civil unrest over imperial succession in Tudor, then that would surely mean an end to the war that has been raging for 100 years. The king asks his generals how they would feel about an all-out attack on the fortress, due to Tudor's civil unrest. They say it would be far too risky, as morale is the lowest it's ever been and many of their men are on the brink of desertion. As they're discussing, one of the men says to Griffith that even his band of the Hawk wouldn't be able to handle it. Griffith casually says he could if he were given the orders. This catches the attention of everyone in the room. Griffith doubles down, saying he wouldn't need a large force. Simply the band of the Hawk alone would be able to accomplish it. Everyone in the room is alarmed at Griffith's overconfidence, putting a mere 5,000 men at a defending fortress that holds 30,000. The king asks him if he's being serious. Griffith nods and the king orders for the Hawks to capture Doldrey. Elsewhere, we cut to the fortress of Doldrey. Boscone is being told about the band of the Hawks being on the march, and is shocked that they expect to take the stronghold with a mere 5,000 men. The high-ranking noble of the castle, with his harem of Griffiths, orders Boscone that in the coming battle, he wants to make sure the leader of the Hawks is brought in alive and unharmed. Boscone argues that if Griffith is killed, it will dissolve any momentum Midland has and assures their victory. The noble, Gennon, being the massive simp that he is, tells Boscone that he has his orders. A few days later, in the morning, the band of the Hawks square up outside of Doldrey, with their backs to the river. They're talking about how difficult a full frontal assault will be. When they ask Guts, they can win, can't they? Guts says it's just like any other fortress they've taken, just a bit bigger. As long as they stick with Griffith's plan, they will win. Elsewhere, General Adon is welcomed back into the castle. Something looks familiar about this here soldier. Back on the battlefield, Guts gets ready, and Griffith hypes the boys up, before leading a charge towards the castle. General Boscone is told by one of his men that Griffith is leading 2,000 men in the vanguard. Curious about his tactics of splitting his already small army into two, he calls for his own advance guard to meet them and crush them into the dust. The two forces meet head-on, with the band of the Hawk quite easily managing to break through the line of the Purple Rhinos. We cut back to Boscone, who is calming his men who are freaking out about the Hawks breaking through the front line. He points out that they're just taking advantage of their light cavalry to break through the lines and damage morale. He orders his heavy cavalry to meet them head-on and their archers to start firing at them from the flanks. I feel like this guy has played 1 or 2 Total War games before. Arrows begin to rain down upon the Hawks, and Guts is surprised that the enemy doesn't seem shaken at all by their charge. Overlooking the battlefield, Gennon curses Boscone, worrying that Griffith could be killed in a maneuver like this. Then, all of his tier 3 subs would have been for nothing. Seeing the heavy cavalry begin to charge in, Griffith orders for a full retreat back to the main force. Boscone contemplates the reason behind Griffith's actions, saying surely he would have known the consequences of his charge. Gennon then rides over, asking him why he isn't chasing after the retreating force. Boscone begins to reply when Gennon interrupts him, saying that Griffith is to be captured alive, and any man who does so will be rewarded with whatever they want. He then proceeds to take over command of the battlefield, ordering all mounted troops to pursue the enemy, with the main goal of capturing Griffith. This man's really about ready to risk it all, huh? Boscone is worried about the defense of the castle, but is ignored by by Genon. He then turns to his right-hand man, telling him to ignore the order to capture Griffith, saying that all Hawks must be killed by the end of the day, before leading his troops in a charge. Griffith makes his way back to the main forces, where he gives an inspiring speech, basically saying, "Hey, you've got a river behind you. The only way out is through those heavily armed dudes charging right towards you." Tactical genius right here. Griffith leads his men and the two forces meet. The fighting begins in full. Elsewhere, on the battlements of the fortress, two soldiers are casually chatting about trying to get some booze going on, when a small group of the Hawks show up and start making their way inside. They're about to call out about the intruders when they're shot by two disguised guards. We then see more men trying to tell Adon about the Hawks entering the castle, when a few members of his posse run out and cut the men down. We see Casca take off her helmet and order her troops to close the gates and not let anyone escape. She thinks to herself that Griffith's plan is working perfectly when she hears something behind her. She sees Adon attacking one of her men, grabbing his spear as he passes out. She tells her men not to interfere. This is her fight. She wants a little bit of revenge. Adon gladly accepts. Back on the battlefield, Bosco notices someone is absolutely destroying his men. He rides up to Guts and they clash. He demands to know who he is. After telling him he's the raiding leader of the Hawks, their battle begins. After a few moments of fighting, it appears they're evenly matched, to the amazement of everyone watching. Nearby, Genon sees his queen, and so does Boscone's right-hand man. Boscone manages to knock Guts off of his horse, and Griffith, upon seeing this, tries to make his way over to him, but gets caught up in the battle. Boscone's man is riding in a straight line towards Griffith, aiming to end it here. As he gets close, Genon comes in and puts a stop to his charge. Back at the fortress, the fight between Casca and Adon is heating up, with Casca managing to push him back so much that he falls down a flight of stairs. He asks her how it's possible that she's this much better than when they previously fought. She says he caught her at a bad time the other day, as she was a bit under the weather. They fight their way down to the ground, when Casca falls victim to one of his family's secret techniques.
It's the captain of the raiders!
The old look over there. He breaks her sword and pins her back against a wall. Adon then makes some more seedy comments, when she takes a deep breath, grabbing the spearhead, rotating around, pulling out his side sword and stabbing Adon through the mouth. Back on the field, Guts is holding his own against Boscone, but is on the defensive, when 4 members of the Hawks ride in trying to assist him. Guts tells them to stop, but it's too late. Boscone cleaves his halberd around himself, killing all of the men who tried to attack him. After this, he charges Guts, who grabs a falling banner. Boscone comes in with a massive swing, looking to end the fight. He barely manages to dodge the banner thrown by Guts as he proceeds to swing down. His swing kicks up dirt all around them, and Boscone thinks he's won. However, to his shock, he hears Guts begin to scream. In one strike, Guts cuts clean through both Boscone and his horse. Morale in the Tudor army begins to falter, when Genon orders them to fight on, saying that they still have the upper hand in numbers. However, the Band of the Hawk all begin to cheer out, and we see Doldrey, littered with banners from the Band of the Hawk. Guts tells them that their general is dead and their fortress is fallen.
So yeah, I'd say you lost.
The Hawks all start crying out in victory, and the morale of the Tudor army completely crumbles, turning into a full-blown rout. Even Genon's guards flee, and Genon gets knocked to the ground. A short time later, after the dust is settled, Griffith marches his horse up to Genon, who is more than happy to see him. Genon tries to get close to him, but Griffith pulls back. Worried, he asks if Griffith resents him. Griffith says that he doesn't bear him any resentment. In fact, saying that by using him, he was able to provide for hundreds of his men, and they didn't have to risk their lives on the battlefield. He tells Genon that the only thing he can do for those soldiers that share his dream is to continue winning for them. That's why he will do whatever is needed, telling Genon that he was merely a stone lying by the path he is traveling, nothing more. In a rage, Genon charges and promptly gets stabbed in the head, his body left there in the dust. Sometime later, the Band of the Hawk returns back to Midland's capital, Wyndham, where they receive a hero's welcome. Some are soaking up the attention, while others are a bit lost in thought. Later that night, a dance is organized to celebrate the end of the 100-year war. Griffith proceeds to get fawned over by a bunch of women. Caucus talks himself up to a bunch of women. Guts, uncomfortable with the attention, tries to run away from a bunch of women. And Rickett is dangerously close to getting arda-arded. As Guts sits down, away from anyone, he sees Casca in the same sort of situation he was in. She walks over to him, asking for a bit of help from the nobles that keep pestering her. They both walk outside together. They briefly chat, and she asks him if she looks silly in this sort of clothing. He says not at all. You look lovely. She says she's surprised to see him here. He doesn't usually show up to this sort of thing. He tells her that he wanted to see it through to the end. He wanted to see how far Griffith could reach. But he's had enough of looking up at Griffith from just inside his dream. He's the only one he doesn't want looking down on him. Inside, the king begins to make a bit of a speech. He announces that this victory is owed in great part to the services from the Band of the Hawk. Because of this, the king grants Griffith and his men the title of White Phoenix Knights, for the first time in Midland's history, raising them all to nobles. After this, the dancing begins. Casca sees Griffith about to take a dance with Princess Charlotte. She begins to look dejected when Guts walks up and they begin to dance. If this is your first time with Berserk, just soak all this happiness in. Just enjoy it. We then cut to a snowy morning, quite some time later, where we see Guts alone, making his way through the city. He reaches the top of a hill and gives the city one last look before continuing on. Farther up his path, at a tree, Pippin, Judo, Ricket, Casca, and Corcus are all there waiting for him, seemingly aware of his plans to leave the Band of the Hawk. Casca asks him why he's planning to leave now, when their labors are finally starting to bear fruit. He says he appreciates all this, but he's made his mind up. As he pushes through, he sees Griffith, who asks him if he's actually leaving. Guts says he is. Ricket tries to understand why Guts would leave now of all times, when Judo tells him that the decision is Guts's alone. Guts begins to walk off, and Casca again tries to stop him, when Griffith begins to draw his sword, telling Guts that he might have forgotten, but he belongs to him. If he wishes to now be free, the rules have not changed. He must fight for his freedom.
Would you settle for a smile and some fond farewell wishes?
Casca tries to mediate a solution, but Pippin pulls her back, with Judo saying there's no going back now. Guts reflects on the words Griffith said that night, that if someone truly believes in their dream, they should put their heart and soul into it, even if it means opposing him. Guts believes he is just doing what he has to do, to be seen as an equal to Griffith and to be his friend. Griffith declares to himself that he won't let Guts leave, no matter what. His plan of attack is to get the first strike in. He will deflect Guts' downward swing, and then strike his shoulder. He's worried that if his attack is even slightly off, he might kill him, but if he can't have Guts, no one can. Snow falls from a nearby branch and Griffith charges in. Guts retaliates, and in a moment it's over. Underestimating how strong Guts had gotten in their time together, as soon as Griffith's sword made contact, it snapped clean off. He falls to his knees. Guts grabs his things, telling Griffith goodbye, before walking off into the distance. I'm sure Griffith won't take this loss too hard now, will he? That night, feeling powerless and depressed upon losing Guts, he makes his way to Princess Charlotte's chambers, where, in a desperate attempt to be in control again, he bangs the king's daughter, which is seen by one of the handmaidens. The next morning, as Griffith leaves, he is apprehended by the palace guards, who accuse him of treason. Meanwhile, the Band of the Hawk are called to an empty field, and are wondering why Griffith would get them to come here with no weapons or armor, when Pippin hears something and yells out, Just then, arrows begin falling from the sky onto the Band of the Hawk. We see that it's Midland's army. We cut to Griffith in a prison cell, being whipped by the king, who is berating him. Griffith then says he understands now, saying how political marriages are the way the world works, but for some reason Princess Charlotte was never mentioned in marriage talks. Griffith then calls him out, saying that he must lust over his own daughter, perhaps waiting for her to come to him. This drives the king into a rage and he begins whipping Griffith again. Back on the field, Casca manages to hold it together and rally everyone into charging towards the enemy at their weakest point, breaking through. Back in the cell, after the king has had his fill, he orders this gross little dude to do his absolute worst to Griffith, but to make sure he stays alive. Sometime later, the torturer tells Griffith that he's impressed. He's never had anyone not make a sound while he's gone to work on them before. He suddenly notices the bayonet around Griffith's neck and grabs at it, when its eyes open, causing him to freak out and drop it down the drain, floating off, far away from Griffith. When he was a child, he got given a strange artifact by an old fortune teller. You won't believe what happened next. We start things off at a campsite, about a year after the events of the previous movie, where we see a few of the remaining members loyal to the Band of the Hawk. Inside a tent, we see Casca analyzing a map, when Judo comes in, telling her that he hopes she's not pushing herself too hard, that they couldn't afford to have her collapse in battle. He then mentions that Ricket has returned with information relating to where Griffith is being held. Outside, we see a horse, beginning to notice that something is up. Back inside, Casca tells Judo that she knows they need to be careful and can't race right in. But after they've been on the run for so long now, she doesn't know how much more the Band of the Hawks can take. Just then, they hear a horse cry out, and we see several of the men getting cut down. They both rush out of the tent, seeing the bodies of their men, and Casca calls out that they're being raided by the enemy. The Band of the Hawk then gets ready for battle. Casca suddenly hears a whirring sound above her, and narrowly dodges a pair of chakram thrown by a veiled figure, who suddenly appears behind her and begins to attack. They fight briefly before he backs off as the actual force of the raiding party arrives, comprised of Midland soldiers. He then rushes back in and up to Casca, quickly gaining the upper hand, pinning her to the ground, telling her that the fight is his, and if she tells her men to stand down, then he will let her live, giving her until the count of 3. Just as he reaches 3, he gets kicked in the ass and sent flying back several meters. Casca then looks up, seeing everyone's favorite Chad, Guts, who tells her not to worry about that guy, that she needs to get up and lead the men. He will take care of him. They have a short stare down before the veiled man pulls out these sword whip-like blades. Guts manages to avoid the strikes, then, using sheer strength, swings his sword upwards before the blades make contact with him. The air pressure from this swing deflects the blades completely, and Guts jumps through the dust towards him. The man barely manages to block the strike, evading backwards. One of his men then point out that the Hawks have rallied with Casca now being in command, and they fall back. Later that night, Guts gets filled in on the tea by Judo about what happened after his duel with Griffith. The next morning, Guts and Casca are walking in silence for a while, when she suddenly tells him to draw his sword, going in for a strike at his head. He blocks it and is shocked that she really is trying to kill him. He evades her attacks and then asks what her problem is. She tells him that it's all his fault, that he ruined everything, saying that he was the only one Griffith wanted, the only one that was truly close to him, the only one that made him weak. Charging in, she tells him that Griffith was no good without him. This takes Guts aback, and he remembers Griffith's slouched position after beating him in their fight. At the same time, Casca's sword strikes into his side, giving him a shallow wound. Guts grabs the blade, pulling it from his side and saying that that can't be true. He was just acting the way Griffith would have, by leaving to find his dream. Casca then drops her sword and makes her way to the edge of the cliff, telling him that she lied when she said she wanted to be Griffith's sword, admitting that she loved Griffith and was jealous of Princess Charlotte despite knowing how likely it would be for her and Griffith to marry. She then tells him that none of that matters anymore though, and that she is just so tired now. She then asks Guts to take over command of the remaining band of the Hawk, where she begins to throw herself off the edge into the falls below. Guts reacts quickly, grabbing her with his injured hand, managing to pull her up and throw her to safety.
From now on, you're not allowed to ever go near the edge of a cliff again, you hear me?
Casca then approaches him, tenderly calling him a fool, and saying how he is always getting hurt or injured because of her. They then have a bit of which quickly escalates as they both finally realize that they're just two broken people who found love in each other. And after they save Griffith, they will leave all of this and go on their own together. After the deed is done, Guts hears some strange noises in the forest around him as a mist starts to set in. Grabbing his sword, he goes to make sure there are no enemies around, when a skeletal figure mounted on an ethereal horse begins to ride up towards him, giving him a grim warning, explaining that a rain of blood, the likes of which is unimaginable, will soon fall down upon him. But the figure tells him to struggle, endure, and contend against this calamity, for that alone is what he has always done. The figure then walks away, fading into the mist. We then cut to later that night, with the gang attempting their rescue on Griffith. As they find a hidden way through the walls into the castle, Guts is skeptical about whether or not the person they got this information from is trustworthy. Casca tells him not to worry though, as two individuals begin to walk up towards them, one of whom is revealed to be Princess Charlotte, their inside informant looking to get Griffith out just as much as they are. As they make their way far down into the earth where Griffith is being kept, Charlotte gives some history, explaining that a long time ago, during the Age of Wars, one man appeared and put a stop to the endless fighting that was going on. King Geyserich. He conquered all countries and united the entire continent under his banner. Rumor has it that he always went into battle with a helmet shaped like a skull. As the story goes, God sent down 5 angels to put an end to him and his kingdom sometime during his reign, the remnants of which are somewhere down at the bottom of this tower, though no one who has ever gone down to the bottom has ever returned. Upon entering the cell in which Griffith is being kept, they find him lying on the floor, a shell of what his former self was. All of his tendons have been cut, his tongue was removed, skin flayed, and crucial parts of his muscle removed. Upon awakening and finding Guts being the one trying to rescue him, Griffith takes his hand and puts it around Guts' throat, trying to squeeze, as he sees Guts as the reason he's in there. Guts, however, hugs his boy while crying, and Griffith, not having the strength, lets go. Just then, the doors to the jail cell closes, and the mangled jailer we previously saw begins taunting them, asking how they're going to escape now. The jailer then begins describing all of the horrid things he has done to Griffith over the past year, saying that what he's been doing to him should be considered a work of art, before displaying his crown jewel, Griffith's tongue. Guts then rams his sword through the door, breaking it and impaling the jailer on one end.
This is where you die, and you won't be getting into heaven double-tongued.
He then holds him off the edge into the pit, letting his sword cut through him and fall into the abyss. We then see that a garrison has found out what they're trying to do, and when Casca suggests that they fall back into the cell, Guts instead wants to let out a bit of steam, when he runs up and easily cuts through all of the men like a hot knife through butter. Then, after they reach the surface, with the help of one of the villagers, they get some carts and begin riding away from the city, all the while being chased by the king's men, which get pretty easily destroyed by our boy Pippin and Guts as they reach the rest of the band of the Hawk. After taking camp, Judo explains to Casca that because of the severe damage to his arms and legs, Griffith will never be able to stand, let alone hold a sword ever again. Casca then gathers all of the men and drops the harsh news to them, that there is no way they can go back to the way things were like they were hoping, with Griffith leading them. This completely demoralizes them, but they say they've still got Casca to lead them, who then says she needs to think something's over as she goes to check on Griffith's bandages. Judo and Guts then sit in a field, when he says that if Guts is planning on leaving again, this time he better take Casca with him. Inside the cart, while replacing Griffith's bandages, Casca begins to break down upon seeing him this way, when he was once so strong. Griffith then throws himself on Casca, trying to somehow feel and reclaim a sense of power he had so long ago. Sometime later, Guts finds Casca outside the cart when she starts crying to him, telling him that she can't go with him. She says she has to stay with Griffith and the Band of the Hawk, saying that he's so small and frail now she couldn't possibly leave him. Guts then tries to say that in that case, he will stay, but she reminds him about that night outside the castle so long ago, saying that if he really is Griffith's equal, then he knows he can't stay. Inside, Griffith is watching the both of them while lying in his broken state, when an apparition of his younger self appears before him, asking him what he's doing, showing him the kingdom he has always aspired for before stating that there's still time to play and the sun hasn't gone down yet. Just then, the cart he is in begins to take off down the hill, with Guts following close behind. We then cut to Griffith, horse lead in mouth, riding towards his dream, all the while thinking to himself that he's rested far too long and he's gotta go. It's not over yet. Just then, the cart hits some rocks, throwing Griffith from the front seat out and into the lake that is nearby. After he lands, he realizes that his arm is broken, snapped clean, and sees a very sharp stick pointing out of the lake, which he crawls over to and tries to cut open his own throat with. He, however, doesn't have the strength to take his own life, and instead lies in the water, crying. His hand then feels something familiar. Upon reaching out and grabbing it, he finds the bayonet that he lost so long ago, and as he picks it up, the whole area begins to go dark as an eclipse sets in. As the sun becomes fully hidden, Guts gets close to reaching him, to which Griffith tries to run away from, thinking to himself for Guts to stay away. As Guts runs closer, humanoid shapes suddenly appear directly behind Griffith, as if waiting for something. Regardless, Guts continues on. The bayonet then begins to shift and form into that of a humanish face, and as Guts grabs Griffith by the shoulder, Griffith is then sent into his final breaking point, having just tried to kill himself, which he failed, then being saved by the man who he sees as the blame for his entire situation being here. The bayonet then begins screaming, activating and transporting the entire Band of the Hawk into a nightmarish landscape, with the land being encompassed by faces. In the face of all of this, Casca manages to pull her men back in line and get them into formation. Guts then picks up Griffith, trying to get back to the Hawks when he sees the strange humanoid people starting to shout out that the time has come. Just then, a giant female rises out of the ground, flapping her dark raven wings, which then turn into the wings of a bat, the God-Hand Slan. Then, a giant figure wearing glasses rushes down to the Band of the Hawk, before popping like a balloon, revealing his smaller actual size, the God-Hand Ubik. Then, another rises out of the ground, bellowing a low hum which makes the Hawks block their ears, the God-Hand Conrad. And finally, in a whirl of mist, the big brain himself, God-Hand Void. Void then welcomes them all to this sacred festival, referring to Griffith as the honorable child, saying that in this time and place, they are kinsmen. Guts then pulls out his knife, telling them that that's enough, calling everything here bullshit, saying that every part of Griffith is human, so don't compare themselves to him. Slan then explains to them that their sacrifice here is going to make Griffith a demon. Ubik elaborates, saying that from the moment he obtained that crimson bayonet, he had the potential to become a member of the God-Hands like them. Slan then says that all the rest here are to become worthy sacrifices for the transformation process, explaining that Griffith is going to be the one who will offer all of them up, exchanging their lives for him to become a member of the God-Hand. Guts says that's impossible, thinking there's no way Griffith would do that, when Void claims that it all lies within the current of causality, stating that it's almost time for the invocation of doom. Conrad then rises Griffith and Guts from the ground high up towards the God-Hand. As Guts struggles to hold onto him through the rising platform, Griffith's arm begins to snap, causing him to let go. Guts then plunges his dagger into the wall while falling. Now face to face with the God-Hand, Griffith is then shown his past by Ubik, in order to properly understand why it is he's here. We then get a younger child version of Griffith, running through the streets, which quickly turn into a sea of dead and decaying bodies. An illusion in the form of the fortune teller that gave him the bayonet then walks up to him, asking him what he's making such a noise about. He explains that it's terrible, because there's so much death and destruction around him. The fortune teller then tells him that it's his fault, as he's the one that brought them all here in the first place. And if he never said he wanted to have his own kingdom, none of this would have happened. Griffith then tries to defend himself by saying that he never forced anyone to come with him, but she tells him to shut up, stating that he knew all along that his journey would cause all of this death to happen, and if he wants to reach that castle in his dreams, he'll have to stack many, many more corpses to get there. Griffith then thinks to himself that he knew all along, and if he apologizes now for the way he acted, it would make all of their deaths be in vain, and he will never be able to reach his dreams. The vision fades, and Void tells him that he's always longed for his castle in the heavens, piling up the corpses along the way. Slan then explains that as he reaches the end of his journey, his way back is now shut, but his band of the Hawks are the answer to the end of his blood-soaked journey. Void then explains that all that's left to do is pile up the corpses one last time, and chant the phrase, "I sacrifice." Guts then reaches Griffith, who smiles, turns to Guts, and thinks to himself that in the thousands of comrades and endless enemies, he was the only one who ever made him forget his dream. Griffith then chants the phrase, and Guts is unable to reach him as the hand thereon shuts around him. Void then announces that the promised time has come, firing out the invocation of doom, implanting all members of the Hawk with a brand. All of the humanoid figures that have been standing around until now then suddenly transform into eldritch demonic beings, before attacking and slaughtering the band of the Hawks, while Void states that they have now been marked with the brand of sacrifice, and that from now until their last moments of agonizing death, their lives will fuel the new rebirth of Griffith. The band of the Hawks all then proceed to give their lives trying to save Casca, with Judo managing to somewhat get away from the carnage in the center. Outside, we see Rickett, having just reached the rendezvous point he had with everyone, although now there is a giant tornado, where he sees the skeletal figure from earlier fighting with Zod the Immortal in his transformed state. Elsewhere, the horse Judo and Casca are riding suffers a fall, and Judo, while trying to protect Casca, suffers a fatal wound to the chest. As they try to get away, Judo reflects to himself how there were always so many things that he wanted to tell Casca, when numerous more demons then begin to approach her. Elsewhere, Guts is trying to cut up the hand holding Griffith when the demons begin to show up, and using just a f***ing knife he manages to hold them off, before breaking this guy's horn and killing him. He manages to fight through several more of them before getting knocked off the hand and beginning to fall far down into the sea of blood below, where he sees the remains belonging to all of his comrades, before getting circled in by all of the demons. Meanwhile, Void declares the birth of their newest member of the God Hand, the Wings of Darkness, Femto, who then glides down to Guts. A now stripped naked Casca is then brought to him, and Griffith begins to sexually assault her right in front of Guts' eyes. As he tries to run over and make him stop, his arm is bitten by a demon and he is held in place, forced to watch. Out of desperation, he then begins cutting into his arm before ripping it off. As Guts rushes over, stabbing at his face, his arm has been stopped mid-air by Griffith's new power as a member of the God Hand. But to the shock of everyone, Guts is still managing to push through out of sheer will, before Griffith suddenly throws him up into the air, where he is then again held down and forced to watch, as his eye is then stabbed out by one of the demons. Just then, a crack begins to form in the center of the eclipse, and Skull Knight rushes in, attacking Void, and it seems like both of them knew what each other was gonna do. He then starts carving through tens of demons with complete ease. Skull Knight then grabs Casca and Guts, taking them both out of the interstice of the eclipse and over to Rickett. Guts then awakens quite some time later, with bandages covering his body. Rickett then comes down to check on him, before asking what had happened in there, when Guts interrupts, desperately asking where Casca is. Erica then explains that she's right over there, and as he goes to approach her, she begins to freak out, not letting him touch her. Confused, he again tries and she runs away. Rickett then explains that she doesn't remember anything, and that she's been acting like this since they got here. Not being able to take the fact that Casca might be gone too, Guts then starts running and screaming through the forest while remembering all of his fallen companions. By the time he stops, night has fallen, and as it begins to rain, his brand of sacrifice suddenly starts to hurt and bleed, as demonic spirits begin appearing all around him. They then begin to take possession of his body, when Skull Knight appears, telling him to steel himself, which he does, expelling the possession. He is then told that the brand will affect creatures of darkness, as every last drop of blood in his body has been offered for them. Guts then runs over, grabs Skull Knight's sword, and begins fighting them off for the entire night until morning, where he is told that this is now his fate. We then finish off many months later, with Guts getting himself ready and arming himself up with the Dragon Slayer and various other weapons to go and hunt the demons known as Apostles. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It only takes a second and it really helps me out.